Hey guys, tonight I'm going to tell you about the one job in ancient Egypt that had a 90% mortality rate in the first year, and chances are you've never even heard of it. We're diving into what work and daily life was really like along the Nile, where a single mistake could mean the difference between feeding your family and watching them starve. Forget the noble pyramid builders and wise scribes Hollywood sold you. The truth is, most Egyptians worked jobs so dangerous, so backbreaking, and so poorly paid that you probably wouldn't survive your first week. But here's what's fascinating. They found ways to create joy, meaning, and even moments of pure happiness in the midst of unimaginable hardship. Tonight, you'll discover the secret that kept an entire civilization working, dreaming, and thriving for over 3,000 years. So before we cross into the ancient world, take a moment to like this video, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And subscribe if you'd like to join me on more journeys through history. Leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in tonight and what time zone is keeping you company. There's something beautiful about how these voices from antiquity unite us across time and distance. As you settle into your comfortable position, imagine the warm glow of dawn breaking over an ancient Egyptian village, where the air is filled with the sounds of daily life beginning anew. The soft calls of workers heading to their tasks, the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture, and the rhythmic sounds of craftsmen beginning their work provide a soothing backdrop as we step back over 3 millennia to discover how the people of the pharaohs lived, worked, and found meaning in their daily existence. Tonight's exploration will take us from the humble, mud-brick homes of farmers and craftsmen to the grand workshops of master artisans, from the bustling markets of Memphis to the quiet scribal schools where young minds learned the sacred art of writing. Close your eyes and let the ancient world unfold around you as we discover the timeless human experiences of work, community, and the pursuit of a meaningful life that connected every Egyptian, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest field worker. In ancient Egypt, the rhythm of daily life was intimately connected to the eternal cycle of the Nile River, whose annual flooding determined not only when crops would be planted and harvested, but also how entire communities would organize their work, their celebrations, and their understanding of time itself. The Egyptian calendar was divided into 3 seasons that reflected this agricultural cycle. Akit, the inundation season; Pare, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. During Akit, which lasted from July to October, the Nile would rise and flood the surrounding farmland, depositing rich, fertile silt that would nourish the coming year's crops. For the farmers, who made up the vast majority of Egypt's population, this was a time of both rest and preparation. The fields were underwater, so agricultural work was impossible, but this period was far from idle. It was during the flood season that many farmers would work on the great construction projects that defined Egyptian civilization, the pyramids, temples, and monuments that required enormous amounts of human labor. The organization of this seasonal labor was a marvel of ancient administration. Village scribes would keep careful records of which men were available for work, what skills they possessed, and how long they could be away from their homes. Teams of workers would be assembled and transported to construction sites, where they would live in temporary camps and work under the supervision of skilled foremen and architects. Life in these work camps was highly organized and surprisingly comfortable. Workers were provided with food, clothing, and medical care, and they were paid for their labor with rations of bread, beer, and other necessities. The work was hard, but it was also seen as a sacred duty that contributed to the glory of Egypt and the favor of the gods. Many workers took pride in their contributions to these eternal monuments and would boast to their children and grandchildren about the role they had played in their construction. When the floodwaters began to recede in late October, marking the beginning of Purée, the growing season, the focus of daily life shifted dramatically. The farmers would return to their villages and begin the intensive work of preparing the land for planting. The flood had left behind not only fertile silt, but also debris, stones, and sometimes damage to irrigation, channels, and field boundaries that had to be repaired before planting could begin. The preparation of the fields was a community effort that involved entire villages working together. Men would use wooden plows pulled by oxen to break up the soil and create furrows for planting. Women and children would follow behind, removing stones and debris and smoothing the soil to create the best possible conditions for the seeds. The timing of this work was crucial, as the soil had to be prepared while it was still moist from the flood, but not so wet that it would be damaged by the heavy work. The planting season required careful coordination and timing. Different crops had to be planted at different times and in different locations, depending on their water requirements and growing seasons. Wheat and barley, the staple grains that formed the foundation of the Egyptian diet, were typically planted first. In the fields closest to the river, where the soil was richest and most reliable, the actual planting was often done by teams of workers moving across the fields in organized patterns. Seeds would be scattered by hand and then covered by workers, using hoes or by having livestock trample the fields to press the seeds into the soil. The work was rhythmic and repetitive, often accompanied by songs and chants that helped workers maintain their pace and coordinate their movements. Throughout the growing season, the crops required constant attention and care. Irrigation channels had to be maintained and adjusted to ensure that water reached all parts of the fields. Weeds had to be removed regularly to prevent them from competing with the crops for nutrients and water. Birds and other pests had to be frightened away from the growing plants, a task that was often assigned to children who would spend long days in the fields with slings and noisemakers. The harvest season Shamu, which lasted from March to July, was the most intensive and important time of the agricultural year. The success or failure of the harvest would determine whether the community would prosper or struggle in the coming year. The timing of the harvest was critical. Crops had to be gathered at exactly the right moment when they were fully mature, but before they began to deteriorate or fall to the ground. The harvest was a community celebration as much as it was work. Entire villages would mobilize for the harvest, with every able-bodied person contributing to the effort. Men would cut the grain with sickles, working in teams that moved across the fields in coordinated sweeps. Women and children would gather the cut grain into bundles and transport it to threshing areas where it would be processed. The threshing of grain was accomplished by having cattle or donkeys trample it to separate the kernels from the stalks. This process required skill and timing to ensure that the grain was properly separated without being damaged. The threshed grain was then winnowed by tossing it into the air on windy days, allowing the lighter chaff to blow away while the heavier grain kernels fell back to the ground. The measurement and storage of the harvested grain was a crucial process that was carefully supervised by government officials. Scribes would record the amount of grain produced by each field and calculate the taxes that were owed to the pharaoh. The grain would then be stored in large granaries where it would be protected from moisture, pests, and theft until it was needed. For the individual farmer, the harvest represented the culmination of a year's work and the foundation of his family's security for the coming year. A good harvest meant prosperity and plenty, while a poor harvest could mean hardship and hunger. The emotional intensity of the harvest season was reflected in the religious ceremonies and celebrations that accompanied it, as communities gave thanks to the gods for their bounty and prayed for continued favor in the years to come. The daily routine of agricultural work was shaped not only by the seasons, but also by the rhythm of the sun. Work would begin before dawn, when the air was cool and the light was soft. The most strenuous tasks would be completed during the early morning hours, before the heat of the day became too intense. During the hottest part of the day, workers would rest in whatever shade they could find, often sleeping until the late afternoon when work could resume. The tools used by Egyptian farmers were simple but effective, designed to work efficiently. In the unique conditions of the Nile Valley, wooden plows with bronze or iron points could break up even the hardest soil. Sickles with sharp bronze or iron blades could cut through grain stalks cleanly and efficiently. Hoes and mattocks could break up clods of earth and remove weeds with minimal effort. The maintenance and care of these tools was an important part of agricultural life. Farmers would spend the quiet hours of the day sharpening blades, repairing handles, and crafting new tools to replace those that had worn out. The knowledge of how to make and maintain agricultural tools was passed down from father to son, ensuring that each generation would have the skills needed to work the land effectively. Beyond the agricultural fields that sustained Egyptian civilization lay a world of workshops and studios where skilled craftsmen and artisans created the magnificent objects that have made ancient Egypt famous throughout history. These master workers possessed knowledge and skills that had been refined over centuries, passed down through generations of apprentices who learned not just techniques, but also the sacred traditions that made their work a form of worship and artistic expression. The organization of craft production in ancient Egypt was based on a guild system that provided structure, quality control, and social support for workers in specialized trades. Each craft had its own traditions, its own patron deities, and its own methods for training new workers and maintaining standards of excellence. The most skilled craftsmen enjoyed high social status and could earn substantial incomes from their work, while even ordinary craft workers were generally better off than agricultural laborers. Stone carving was perhaps the most prestigious of all Egyptian crafts, as it was the skill that created the monuments and sculptures that proclaimed Egypt's power and glory to the world. Master stone carvers were among the most respected artisans in Egyptian society, and their workshops were centers of learning and innovation where new techniques were developed and perfected. The process of stone carving began with the selection of appropriate raw materials. Different types of stone were used for different purposes, depending on their hardness, color, and availability. Limestone was the most common building stone, quarried from cliffs along the Nile and used for the construction of pyramids, temples, and tombs. Granite was prized for its hardness and beauty, and was used for obelisks, sarcophagi, and the most important architectural elements. The quarrying of stone was a massive undertaking that required careful planning and coordination. Teams of workers would use copper and bronze tools to cut blocks of stone from quarry faces, working in carefully planned sequences that would yield the largest possible blocks with the least waste. The blocks would then be transported to workshops or construction sites using sledges, rollers, and ramps that allowed even enormous stones to be moved with relatively simple technology. In the stone carving workshops, master craftsmen would work with teams of assistants to transform rough blocks into finished sculptures and architectural elements. The process began with careful planning and measurement, as the craftsmen had to ensure that their work would fit perfectly into its intended location. Detailed drawings and models would be created to guide the carving process and ensure that all elements would work together harmoniously. The actual carving was done with a variety of tools, from heavy hammers and chisels for rough shaping to delicate picks and abrasives for fine detail work. The craftsmen had to understand not only the techniques of carving, but also the properties of different types of stone and how they would respond to different tools and techniques. The work required enormous patience and skill, as a single mistake could ruin months of careful work. The finishing of stone sculptures involved polishing and sometimes painting to achieve the desired appearance. Different grades of abrasives were used to smooth the stone surface and remove tool marks. Paint was applied in carefully planned layers to create the brilliant colors that made Egyptian sculptures so striking. The pigments used were made from minerals and other natural materials that were ground to fine powders and mixed with binding agents. Metalworking was another crucial craft that provided the tools, weapons, and decorative objects that Egyptian society required. Egyptian metalworkers were skilled in working with copper, bronze, silver, and gold, and they developed sophisticated techniques for casting, forging, and decorating metal objects that were admired throughout the ancient world. The production of metal objects began with the smelting of, or to extract, pure metal. This process required specialized furnaces that could reach the high temperatures needed to melt metal and separate it from impurities. The furnaces were carefully designed to provide efficient combustion and to allow workers to control the temperature and atmosphere inside the smelting chamber. The casting of metal objects was done using molds made from clay or stone. The craftsmen had to understand how metal would flow and cool in the mold, and how to design the mold to produce objects with the desired shape and properties. Complex objects might require multiple molds and careful assembly of separately cast components. Forging was used to shape metal objects by heating them and hammering them into the desired form. This technique required great skill and experience. as the craftsmen had to understand how the metal would respond to heat and pressure, and how to achieve the desired shape without cracking or weakening the metal. Different types of hammers and anvils were used for different types of work, and the craftsmen had to select the right tools for each task. The decoration of metal objects was accomplished through a variety of techniques, including engraving, embossing, and inlay work. Engraving involved cutting designs into the metal surface using sharp tools. Embossing created raised designs by hammering the metal from the reverse side. Inlay work involved setting pieces of different metals or other materials into grooves cut in the base metal to create complex decorative patterns. Jewelry making was a specialized branch of metalworking that required exceptional skill and artistry. Egyptian jewelers created magnificent pieces using gold, silver, and precious stones that were worn by the wealthy and offered to the gods. The techniques used by Egyptian jewelers were remarkably sophisticated, including granulation, filigree, and cloison work that required extraordinary precision and patience. Woodworking was another important craft that provided furniture, tools, and architectural elements for Egyptian society. Egyptian woodworkers had to work with both local woods and imported timber, each of which had different properties and required different techniques. The scarcity of good timber in Egypt made woodworking a particularly valuable skill, and master carpenters were highly respected craftsmen. The preparation of wood for use required careful selection and seasoning to ensure that the finished products would be stable and durable. Different types of wood were used for different purposes, depending on their strength, appearance, and workability. Cedar and other imported woods were reserved for the finest furniture and architectural elements, while local woods were used for more utilitarian purposes. The joinery techniques used by Egyptian woodworkers were sophisticated and effective, allowing them to create strong, durable joints without the use of metal fasteners. Mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, and other traditional techniques were used to assemble furniture and other wooden objects that would last for centuries. The decoration of wooden objects was accomplished through carving, painting, and inlay work. Carved decorations ranged from simple geometric patterns to elaborate scenes depicting religious and mythological subjects. Paint was used to add color and detail to carved work, while inlay work using ivory, ebony, and other materials created rich decorative effects. Textile production was a craft that was practiced in virtually every Egyptian household, but the finest textiles were produced by specialized weavers who created the elaborate fabrics worn by the wealthy and used in religious ceremonies. The production of fine textiles required not only weaving skills, but also knowledge of dyeing, spinning, and finishing techniques that could transform simple plant fibers into luxurious fabrics. The cultivation and processing of flax, the plant used to make linen, was a specialized agricultural activity that required careful timing and technique. The flax had to be harvested at exactly the right stage of maturity and processed immediately to produce the finest fibers. The processing involved retting, breaking, and combing the flax to separate the usable fibers from the woody stems and other plant material. The spinning of flax fibers into thread was typically done by women using simple spindles and distaffs. The quality of the thread depended on the skill of the spinner and the quality of the raw materials. The finest thread was spun so thin that it was almost transparent, and it was used to create the gossamer-light fabrics that were prized by the Egyptian elite. The weaving of linen was done on looms that ranged from simple hand looms used in households to large, complex looms used in professional workshops. The weaver had to understand not only the mechanics of the loom, but also how different thread weights and weaving patterns would affect the appearance and properties of the finished fabric. Deep beneath the scorching sands of the eastern desert, in mines that descended hundreds of feet into the earth, worked the men whose job had the highest mortality rate in all of ancient Egypt. These were the gold miners of the Nubian desert, and their story has been largely forgotten by history. The statistics are staggering. Of every 10 men who descended into the deep gold mines for the first time, only one would still be alive at the end of the year. The 90% mortality rate was a carefully recorded reality that Egyptian administrators tracked with meticulous attention. Why was this work so deadly? The mines were narrow, unstable tunnels that frequently collapsed. The air was thick with dust that slowly suffocated workers. The heat was unbearable, often reaching lethal temperatures. The work was done by lamplight in complete darkness, where a single misstep meant death. The men who worked these mines were prisoners of war, criminals and debtors, sentenced to what everyone understood was slow death. Yet even in these hellish conditions, these men developed their own culture, survival methods, and ways of finding meaning in their final months. The mining process was a marvel of deadly engineering. Teams descended using rope ladders, carrying oil lamps for light. They worked in shifts around the clock, some digging, others hauling, or others working primitive ventilation systems that provided minimal fresh air. Gold extraction required incredible skill. Miners identified gold-bearing quartz veins and followed them hundreds of feet through earth. They used fire-setting techniques, heating rock with fires, then dousing with cold water to crack it for easier breaking. The physical toll was immediate and devastating. Within weeks, most developed the characteristic cough-marking lung disease. Their skin turned gray from dust and smoke. Bodies wasted away from hard labor, poor food, and toxic environment. Most heartbreaking was knowing they'd been forgotten by the world above. Families were told they were dead, names struck from village records. They became non-persons, existing between life and death while extracting gold for pharaohs and gods. Yet the human spirit found ways to assert itself. Miners developed songs and stories passed through brief generations of survivors. They created rituals for honoring the dead, methods of supporting the sick, and codes maintaining dignity facing certain death. The few who survived their first year became leaders and teachers. These veterans possessed life-saving knowledge, which tunnels might collapse, where air was worst, how to recognize cave-in signs. The extracted gold was sacred, the flesh of gods, imperishable and eternal. Miners often joked bitterly that they gave their lives providing divine flesh while their own wasted away in darkness. Mining operations were overseen by administrators keeping detailed records of production, mortality, and costs. Papyrus documents provide chilling glimpses into bureaucratic efficiency with which human lives were expended for gold, calculating optimal worker numbers while factoring expected death rates as business costs. The legacy of these forgotten miners lives in magnificent golden artifacts filling museums today. Every golden mask, precious amulet, and gleaming jewelry represents not just Egyptian craftsmanship, but the lives of men who died extracting raw material from earth. Their sacrifice was the foundation upon which golden glory of ancient Egypt was built. In ancient Egyptian society, literacy was a rare and precious skill that opened doors to advancement, respect, and influence that were closed to those who could not read and write. The scribes who possessed this knowledge formed a distinct social class that served as the backbone of Egyptian administration, religion, and culture. Their daily work involved not just the mechanical act of writing, but the preservation and transmission of the knowledge that held Egyptian civilization together. The training of a scribe began in childhood and required years of dedicated study and practice. Young boys, typically from families that could afford to forego their labor, would be sent to scribal schools, where they would spend their days learning the complex art of hieroglyphic writing. The curriculum was demanding and comprehensive, covering not only writing and reading but also mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and religious knowledge. The scribal schools were usually attached to temples or government offices where students could observe experienced scribes at work and gradually take on more responsible tasks as their skills developed. The learning process was based on repetition and memorization, with students copying classic texts over and over until they had mastered both the technical skills of writing and the content of the texts themselves. The tools of the scribal trade were simple but required skill to use effectively. The primary writing instrument was a reed pen, cut from papyrus or other plants and shaped to create a fine point that could make clean, precise marks. The ink was made from soot mixed with water and a binding agent, creating a black ink that would remain legible for thousands of years. Red ink made from ochre was used for headings, corrections, and special emphasis. The writing surface most commonly used by scribes was papyrus, a paper-like material made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile marshes. The production of papyrus was a specialized craft that involved cutting the plant stems into strips, laying them in overlapping layers, and pressing them together to create smooth, flexible sheets that could be written on with ease. The daily routine of a working scribe varied depending on his position and responsibilities, but it typically involved long hours of careful, concentrated work. Government scribes might spend their days recording tax collections, legal proceedings, or administrative decisions. Temple scribes would copy religious texts, record offerings, and maintain the complex records needed to manage temple properties and activities. The work of copying texts was considered sacred as well as practical, as scribes were responsible for preserving the religious and cultural knowledge that defined Egyptian civilization. The copying of religious texts required not only technical skill, but also spiritual preparation, as the scribe had to ensure that every word was copied exactly and that the sacred power of the text was preserved intact. Legal scribes played a crucial role in Egyptian society by recording contracts, wills, property transfers, and court proceedings. Their work required not only writing skills, but also knowledge of Egyptian law and legal procedures. The documents they created served as the foundation of the legal system and provided the records needed to resolve disputes and enforce agreements. Medical scribes were responsible for copying and preserving the medical knowledge that Egyptian physicians used to treat disease and injury. The medical papyri that have survived from ancient Egypt show that scribes were familiar with complex medical procedures and treatments, and they played an important role in training new physicians and preserving medical knowledge for future generations. Mathematical scribes worked on the complex calculations needed for construction projects, tax collection, and trade. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated and practical, designed to solve real-world problems rather than abstract theoretical questions. Scribes had to be skilled in arithmetic, geometry, and algebra, and they developed efficient methods for performing complex calculations without the aid of modern computational tools. Astronomical scribes were responsible for maintaining the calendar and predicting astronomical events that were important for religious and agricultural purposes. They observed the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and recorded their observations in detailed charts and tables that could be used to predict future events and plan religious ceremonies. The social status of scribes varied considerably depending on their position and the importance of their work. High-ranking scribes who worked for the pharaoh or major temples could achieve considerable wealth and influence, while village scribes who recorded local transactions and events lived more modestly but still enjoyed respect and security that was denied to illiterate workers. The career path of a scribe typically began with basic training in reading and writing, followed by specialization in a particular area such as law, medicine, or administration. Advancement was based on skill, knowledge, and the favor of superiors, and successful scribes could rise to positions of considerable authority and responsibility. The working conditions of scribes were generally comfortable compared to those of manual laborers. They typically worked indoors, protected from the heat and dust that plagued outdoor workers. Their work required concentration and precision rather than physical strength, and they were usually provided with adequate food, clothing, and housing as part of their compensation. The tools and materials used by scribes were carefully maintained and protected, as they were essential for the scribes' livelihood. Writing materials were expensive and had to be used efficiently to avoid waste. Scribes developed techniques for erasing and reusing papyrus, and they learned to write in compact, efficient scripts that conserved space and materials. The preservation of written documents was a constant concern for scribes, who understood that their work would be worthless if it could not be read in the future. Documents were stored in carefully organized archives where they were protected from moisture, insects, and other threats. The most important documents were copied multiple times to ensure that they would survive, even if some copies were lost or damaged. The intellectual life of scribes extended beyond their daily work to include scholarly pursuits and literary activities. Many scribes were accomplished poets, storytellers, and philosophers who contributed to the rich literary tradition of ancient Egypt. They wrote wisdom literature, love poems, adventure stories, and religious hymns that entertained and educated their contemporaries. The training of new scribes was considered a sacred duty that ensured the continuation of Egyptian civilization. Experienced scribes took pride in passing on their knowledge to the next generation, and they developed teaching methods that were both effective and inspiring. The relationship between master and student was often close and personal, extending far beyond the formal period of training. The role of scribes in preserving and transmitting Egyptian culture cannot be overstated. They were the guardians of knowledge, the keepers of tradition, and the link between past and future. Without their dedicated work, the magnificent civilization of ancient Egypt would have been lost to history, and we would know nothing of the achievements and wisdom of this remarkable people. The magnificent monuments that define our image of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, temples, and tombs that have survived for millennia, were created by armies of skilled workers whose daily lives were dedicated to building for eternity. These construction workers, from the master architects who designed the monuments to the laborers who moved the massive stones, formed a complex hierarchy of specialists whose coordinated efforts produced some of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history. The organization of large construction projects in ancient Egypt was a marvel of planning and logistics that required the coordination of thousands of workers over periods that could span decades. The construction of a major pyramid, for example, required not only the workers who actually built the structure, but also the quarrymen who extracted the stone, the transporters who moved it to the construction site, the craftsmen who shaped and finished it. All these activities, the master architects who designed Egyptian monuments, were among the most respected and influential people in Egyptian society. They possessed not only technical knowledge of construction techniques, but also deep understanding of religious symbolism, astronomical principles, and mathematical relationships that were incorporated into their designs. The most famous of these architects, such as Imhotep, who designed the step pyramid at Saqqara, were revered as gods after their deaths. The daily work of planning a major construction project began long before the first stone was laid. Architects had to survey the construction site, calculate the quantities of materials needed, design the internal structure of the building, and create detailed plans that could guide the work of hundreds of specialized craftsmen. They had to understand not only how to create beautiful and impressive structures, but also how to ensure that they would remain stable and intact for thousands of years. The quarrying of stone for construction projects was a massive undertaking that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Quarrymen had to understand the geological properties of different types of stone, and how to extract blocks of the required size and quality without damaging them. The work was dangerous and physically demanding, requiring strength, skill, and courage from the workers who performed it. The techniques used for quarrying stone were sophisticated and effective, allowing Egyptian workers to extract enormous blocks with remarkable precision. Copper and bronze tools were used to cut channels around the blocks, and wooden wedges were driven into cracks and soaked with water to split the stone along natural fracture lines. The blocks were then shaped and finished at the quarry before being transported to the construction site. The transportation of massive stone blocks from quarries to construction sites was one of the most challenging aspects of Egyptian construction projects. Blocks weighing many tons had to be moved over distances that could span hundreds of miles, using only human and animal power and simple mechanical devices such as levers, rollers, and ramps. The construction of the transportation infrastructure needed for major building projects was itself a massive undertaking. Roads had to be built or improved to handle the heavy loads. Harbors had to be constructed to allow stone to be transported by boat, and ramps had to be built to allow blocks to be moved up to the higher levels of the structures being built. The actual construction work was organized into specialized teams, each responsible for a particular aspect of the project. Stonemasons would shape and fit the blocks, while other workers would operate the lifting devices needed to move them into position. The coordination of these teams required careful planning and communication to ensure that the work proceeded smoothly and efficiently. The tools used by Egyptian construction workers were simple but effective, designed to work efficiently with the materials and techniques available at the time. Copper and bronze chisels, hammers, and saws were used for shaping stone and wood. Ropes, levers, and inclined planes were used for moving heavy objects. Plumb lines and measuring rods ensured that the work was accurate and precise. The working conditions on Egyptian construction sites were challenging but not as harsh as is sometimes portrayed in popular culture. Workers were provided with adequate food, water, and shelter, and they were paid for their labor with rations of bread, beer, and other necessities. Medical care was available for workers who were injured, and religious ceremonies were performed to ensure divine protection for the project. The daily routine of construction workers was organized around the rhythm of the sun and the seasons. Work would begin before dawn when the air was cool, and the most strenuous tasks would be completed before the heat of the day became too intense. During the hottest part of the day, workers would rest in whatever shade was available, resuming work in the late afternoon when temperatures began to drop. The seasonal nature of construction work meant that many workers were employed only during certain times of the year. During the flood season, when agricultural work was impossible, farmers would join construction crews and work on building projects. This seasonal labor force provided the manpower needed for major projects while allowing workers to return to their farms. During the growing and harvest seasons, the skills required for construction work varied considerably depending on the specific job being performed. Unskilled laborers could be trained quickly to perform simple tasks such as moving materials or mixing mortar. Skilled craftsmen, however, required years of training to master the techniques needed for stone carving, masonry, or carpentry. The training of construction workers was typically done through apprenticeship programs where young men would work alongside experienced craftsmen and gradually learn the skills of their trade. The apprenticeship system ensured that knowledge and techniques were passed down from generation to generation and that standards of quality were maintained. The social organization of construction crews was hierarchical, with master craftsmen at the top, followed by journeymen, apprentices, and unskilled laborers. Each level had its own responsibilities and privileges, and advancement was possible for workers who demonstrated skill and dedication. The most successful workers could eventually become foremen or even master craftsmen themselves. The religious significance of construction work in ancient Egypt cannot be overstated. The monuments being built were not just impressive structures, but were sacred, spaces that would serve as eternal homes for the gods or the deceased. The workers understood that their labor was contributing to something far greater than themselves, and this gave meaning and purpose to even the most difficult and dangerous tasks. The completion of a major construction project was marked by elaborate ceremonies and celebrations that honored both the gods and the workers who had made the project possible. These celebrations were opportunities for the community to come together and acknowledge the achievement that had been accomplished through their collective efforts. The legacy of Egyptian construction workers extends far beyond the monuments they built. The techniques they developed for quarrying, transporting, and placing massive stones influenced construction practices throughout the ancient world and continue to inspire engineers and architects today. Their achievements demonstrate what can be accomplished when human skill, determination, and organization are focused on a common goal. The bustling markets and trading centers of ancient Egypt were the arteries through which flowed the goods, ideas, and cultural influences that made Egyptian civilization one of the most cosmopolitan and prosperous in the ancient world. The merchants and traders who operated these commercial networks were essential figures in Egyptian society, connecting local producers with distant markets and bringing exotic goods and new ideas to the Nile Valley. The organization of trade in ancient Egypt was based on a complex network of relationships that extended from local village markets to international trading expeditions that reached as far as Nubia, the Levant, and the mysterious land of Punt. At the local level, farmers and craftsmen would bring their products to weekly markets where they could exchange them for goods they could not produce themselves. These local markets were social as well as economic institutions, providing opportunities for people to meet, exchange news, and maintain the social bonds that held communities together. The daily routine of a local merchant began before dawn as he prepared his goods for transport to the market. Fruits and vegetables had to be carefully selected and packed to ensure that they would arrive in good condition. Pottery, textiles, and other manufactured goods had to be protected from damage during transport. The merchant had to calculate not only what goods to bring, but also what prices to charge and what goods to accept in exchange. The transportation of goods to market was accomplished using a variety of methods depending on the distance involved and the nature of the goods being transported. Local markets could be reached on foot or using donkeys to carry heavy loads. Longer distances required boats to transport goods along the Nile or its canals. The most valuable goods might be transported using armed guards to protect them from theft. The actual conduct of business in Egyptian markets was a complex social ritual that involved not just the exchange of goods, but also the maintenance of relationships and the establishment of trust between buyers and sellers. Bargaining was expected and was conducted according to well-established customs that ensured fairness while allowing both parties to feel that they had achieved a good deal. The measurement and evaluation of goods was a crucial aspect of market transactions that required specialized knowledge and equipment. Different goods were measured using different standards, and merchants had to be familiar with all the various weights and measures used in their trade. The quality of goods had to be assessed quickly and accurately, as there was little time for detailed examination in the busy market environment. The payment for goods in Egyptian markets was typically made through barter rather than money, as coined currency was not widely used until the later periods of Egyptian history. This meant that merchants had to be skilled in evaluating the relative value of different goods, and in negotiating exchanges that were fair to both parties. The most common medium of exchange was grain, which had a stable value and was needed by everyone. Long-distance trade was a more complex and risky undertaking that required substantial capital, specialized knowledge, and the ability to manage complex logistics over extended periods. Merchants who engaged in long-distance trade were typically wealthy individuals or partnerships that could afford to invest in large quantities of goods and to wait months or even years for their investments to pay off. The organization of trading expeditions required careful planning and preparation that could take months to complete. The merchants had to decide what goods to take, what route to follow, how many people to employ, and what equipment and supplies would be needed for the journey. They had to obtain permits from government officials and arrange for protection from bandits and other dangers. The goods traded by Egyptian merchants included both necessities and luxuries that reflected the diverse needs and desires of Egyptian society. Grain, the foundation of the Egyptian economy, was exported to other regions in exchange for goods that could not be produced in Egypt. Luxury goods such as gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals were imported from Nubia and other African regions. Cedar wood, silver, and other materials were imported from the Levant. The trading relationships established by Egyptian merchants extended far beyond simple commercial transactions to include diplomatic and cultural exchanges that enriched Egyptian civilization. Foreign merchants who came to Egypt brought not only goods but also new ideas, technologies, and artistic styles that influenced Egyptian culture. Egyptian merchants who traveled to foreign lands served as unofficial ambassadors who spread Egyptian influence and culture throughout the known world. The regulation of trade was an important government function that ensured fair dealing and protected both merchants and consumers from fraud and abuse. Government officials would inspect goods, verify weights and measures, and resolve disputes between traders. The most important trade routes were protected by government forces that ensured the safe passage of merchant caravans. The taxation of trade was a major source of government revenue that helped to fund the administration, military, and construction projects that defined Egyptian civilization. Merchants were required to pay taxes on the goods they traded, and customs officials at borders and major trading centers would collect these taxes and maintain records of commercial activity. The social status of merchants in Egyptian society was complex and varied depending on the scale and success of their operations. Local merchants who operated in village markets were typically of modest social standing, while wealthy long-distance traders could achieve considerable influence and respect. The most successful merchants might be appointed to government positions, or might use their wealth to commission works of art or architecture that would enhance their reputation. The risks faced by merchants were considerable and included not only the possibility of financial loss, but also physical dangers such as shipwreck, bandit attacks, and disease. Merchants had to be prepared to deal with these risks through careful planning, insurance arrangements, and the maintenance of good relationships with local authorities and other merchants who could provide assistance in times of trouble. The seasonal nature of much trade activity meant that merchants had to plan their activities carefully to take advantage of favorable conditions and to avoid periods when travel was difficult or dangerous. The flood season made river transport easier, but land travel more difficult. The harvest season provided opportunities to purchase grain and other agricultural products, but also increased competition among merchants. The training of merchants was typically accomplished through apprenticeship and family connections, rather than formal education. Young men would learn the trade by working with experienced merchants and gradually taking on more responsibility as their knowledge and skills developed. The most successful merchants were those who combined practical knowledge with good judgment and the ability to build and maintain relationships with customers and suppliers. The tools and equipment used by merchants were relatively simple, but had to be reliable and portable. Scales and weights were essential for measuring goods accurately. Containers and packing materials were needed to protect goods during transport. Records and accounts had to be maintained to track transactions and calculate profits and losses. The impact of trade on Egyptian society extended far beyond the economic benefits it provided. Trade brought new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences that enriched Egyptian civilization and helped to make it one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan societies in the ancient world. The merchants who facilitated this exchange were essential contributors to the greatness of ancient Egypt. The temples of ancient Egypt were not merely places of worship, but were complex institutions that served as centers of religious, economic, and social life. The priests and temple workers who staffed these institutions formed a distinct class in Egyptian society, dedicated to maintaining the sacred rituals that ensured the favor of the gods and the prosperity of the kingdom. Their daily lives were governed by strict religious obligations and ritual requirements that set them apart from ordinary Egyptians. The hierarchy of temple personnel was complex and carefully structured, reflecting the importance of different roles and the level of sacred knowledge required for each position. At the top were the high priests, who were responsible for the overall administration of the temple and for performing the most sacred rituals. Below them were various ranks of priests, each with specific duties and responsibilities. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the temple workers who performed the practical tasks needed to keep the temple functioning. The daily routine of temple life began before dawn with the morning rituals that awakened the god and prepared for the day's activities. The high priest, or his designated representative, would enter the inner sanctuary, where the god's statue was housed and performed the elaborate ceremonies that were believed to provide the god with the nourishment and attention needed to maintain divine power and favor. The morning ritual was a complex ceremony that involved multiple stages and required precise execution to be effective. The priest would first purify himself through ritual washing and the recitation of sacred formulas. He would then open the shrine containing the god's statue, remove the statue, and clean and dress it with fresh clothing and jewelry. Offerings of food, drink, and incense would be presented to the god, accompanied by prayers and hymns. The preparation of offerings for the gods was a major activity that required the coordinated efforts of many temple workers. Food had to be prepared according to strict ritual requirements, using only the finest ingredients and following traditional recipes that had been handed down for generations. The bread offered to the gods was made from the finest flour and was often shaped into special forms that had religious significance. The temple kitchens were busy places where skilled cooks worked to prepare the elaborate meals that were offered to the gods multiple times each day. Different gods had different dietary preferences, and the temple cooks had to be familiar with the specific requirements of their particular deity. The preparation of sacred food was considered a form of worship, and the cooks approached their work with the same reverence that priests brought to their rituals. The temple workshops were centers of artistic and craft production, where skilled artisans created the objects needed for religious ceremonies and temple decoration. Sculptors carved statues of gods and pharaohs. Painters decorated temple walls with religious scenes, and metalworkers created the elaborate vessels and implements used in religious rituals. The work produced in these workshops was of the highest quality, as only the finest objects were considered worthy of the gods. The temple scribes were responsible for maintaining the complex records needed to manage temple properties and activities. They recorded the offerings made to the gods, kept track of temple income and expenses, and copied the religious texts that were used in ceremonies and rituals. The temple libraries contained vast collections of religious and scholarly texts that were carefully preserved and copied by generations of scribes. The education of priests was a lengthy and demanding process that began in childhood and continued throughout their careers. Young boys who showed aptitude for religious learning would be sent to temple schools where they would learn to read and write hieroglyphic texts, memorize religious formulas and prayers, and study the complex theology that governed Egyptian religious practice. The curriculum in temple schools was comprehensive and included not only religious subjects, but also mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other areas of knowledge that were considered necessary for educated priests. The students had to memorize vast amounts of text, as the oral tradition was considered as important as written records in preserving religious knowledge. The purification requirements for priests were strict and comprehensive, governing not only their ritual activities, but also their daily lives. Priests had to maintain ritual purity through regular washing, the wearing of clean linen clothing, and the avoidance of certain foods and activities that were considered polluting. The most senior priests were subject to the most stringent requirements, and had to undergo elaborate purification ceremonies before performing the most sacred rituals. The temple economy was complex and extensive, as temples owned vast amounts of land and employed thousands of workers in various capacities. Temple estates produced grain, livestock, and other agricultural products that provided income for temple operations and offerings for the gods. The management of these estates required sophisticated administrative skills and careful record-keeping. The temple workshops produced not only religious objects, but also goods that could be sold to generate income for temple operations. Textiles, pottery, jewelry, and other craft products made in temple workshops were highly prized for their quality and were often exported to other regions. The income from these sales helped to support the large number of people employed by the temples. The social services provided by temples were extensive and included medical care, education, and assistance for the poor and needy. Temple physicians treated both priests and ordinary people using medical knowledge that was preserved in temple libraries. Temple schools educated not only future priests, but also scribes and other educated professionals who served in government and private capacities. The festivals and ceremonies organized by temples were major events that brought together entire communities in celebration and worship. These events required months of preparation and involved elaborate processions, dramatic performances, and communal feasts that strengthened social bonds and reinforced religious beliefs. The priests who organized these events had to coordinate the activities of hundreds of participants and ensure that every detail was executed perfectly. The temple musicians and singers were specialized personnel who provided the musical accompaniment for religious ceremonies. They had to be skilled in both vocal and instrumental music and had to memorize the complex musical compositions that were used in different rituals. The music was considered an essential element of religious worship, as it was believed to please the gods and enhance the effectiveness of the ceremonies. The temple guards and security personnel were responsible for protecting the valuable objects and sacred spaces within the temple complex. They had to be vigilant against theft and vandalism, while also ensuring that only authorized personnel had access to the most sacred areas of the temple. The security of the temple was considered a sacred duty, as any violation of the temple's sanctity could anger the gods and bring misfortune to the community. The maintenance of temple buildings and grounds was a constant activity that required the skills of many different types of workers. Stonemasons repaired and renovated temple structures. Gardeners maintained the sacred groves and gardens, and cleaning staff ensured that all areas of the temple were kept in pristine condition. The physical beauty of the temple was considered essential for maintaining the gods' favor and for inspiring proper reverence in worshippers. The international connections of major temples extended Egyptian religious influence throughout the known world. Temple priests served as diplomats and cultural ambassadors, spreading Egyptian religious ideas and practices to other civilizations. Foreign rulers often sought the blessing of Egyptian gods and the services of Egyptian priests, recognizing the power and prestige of Egyptian religious institutions. The maintenance of order and security in ancient Egypt required a complex system of military and police forces that protected the kingdom from external threats while ensuring domestic peace and stability. The soldiers and police officers who served in these forces came from all levels of Egyptian society and dedicated their lives to protecting the civilization that had given them purpose and meaning. The organization of the Egyptian military was sophisticated and hierarchical, with clear chains of command and specialized units for different types of warfare. At the top were the generals and commanders who planned military campaigns and managed the overall strategy of the kingdom's defense. Below them were the officers who led individual units and were responsible for training and discipline. At the bottom were the common soldiers who formed the backbone of the military force. The daily routine of military life was structured and disciplined, designed to maintain the physical fitness, combat skills, and unit cohesion that were essential for effective military operations. Soldiers would rise before dawn for physical training that included running, wrestling, and weapons practice. The training was demanding and comprehensive, covering not only individual combat skills, but also unit tactics and coordination. The weapons used by Egyptian soldiers were sophisticated and effective designed to give Egyptian forces advantages over their enemies. The composite bow was the primary long-range weapon, capable of penetrating armor at considerable distances. Spears and javelins were used for medium-range combat, while swords, axes, and maces were employed in close combat. The weapons were carefully maintained and regularly inspected to ensure that they would function properly when needed. The armor worn by Egyptian soldiers provided protection while allowing for mobility and flexibility in combat. Leather armor reinforced with metal plates protected vital areas while allowing soldiers to move quickly and effectively. Shields made from wood and leather provided additional protection and could be used offensively as well as defensively. Helmets protected the head while allowing for good vision and hearing. The training of soldiers was a continuous process that began with basic physical conditioning and weapons training and progressed to complex unit maneuvers and tactical exercises. New recruits were trained by experienced veterans who passed on not only technical skills but also the traditions and values that defined the Egyptian military. The training was designed to build not only individual competence but also unit cohesion and loyalty. The logistics of military operations required careful planning and coordination to ensure that armies could be supplied and maintained in the field. Food, water, weapons, and other supplies had to be transported over long distances and distributed. 2 units that might be scattered across wide areas. The quartermaster corps was responsible for managing these complex supply operations and ensuring that soldiers had what they needed to fight effectively. The role of military engineers was crucial for both offensive and defensive operations. They designed and built fortifications that protected Egyptian territory and constructed siege equipment that could be used to attack enemy positions. The engineering skills required for military construction were sophisticated and required knowledge of mathematics, physics, and materials science that was among the most advanced in the ancient world. The naval forces of ancient Egypt were responsible for protecting the kingdom's extensive river and coastal waters. Egyptian warships were designed for both river and sea operations and were equipped with rams, catapults, and other weapons that could be used in naval combat. The sailors who manned these ships were skilled in both seamanship and combat and were capable of conducting complex naval operations. The police forces that maintained domestic order were organized differently from the military, but shared many of the same characteristics and requirements. Police officers were responsible for preventing crime, investigating offenses, and apprehending criminals. They had to be skilled in both investigation techniques and physical combat, as their duties often brought them into conflict with dangerous individuals. The daily routine of police work involved patrolling assigned areas, responding to reports of crime or disorder, and conducting investigations into criminal activity. Police officers had to be familiar with Egyptian law and legal procedures, as they were often required to testify in court proceedings and to ensure that their actions were legally justified. The work was often dangerous and required courage, judgment, and physical skill. The investigation of crimes required specialized knowledge and techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated for the ancient world. Police investigators had to be skilled in interviewing witnesses, examining physical evidence, and reconstructing the sequence of events that led to criminal activity. The techniques they used were based on careful observation and logical reasoning, rather than modern scientific methods, but they were often effective in solving crimes and identifying perpetrators. The court system that processed criminal cases was complex and formal, with established procedures for conducting trials and determining guilt or innocence. Police officers played important roles in this system by presenting evidence, testifying about their investigations, and ensuring that defendants appeared for trial. The legal system was designed to ensure fairness while also protecting society from criminal activity. The punishment of criminals was swift and often severe, reflecting the Egyptian belief that crime threatened the cosmic order that maintained the stability of the universe. Punishments ranged from fines and public humiliation for minor offenses to imprisonment, mutilation, or death for serious crimes. The police were responsible for carrying out these punishments and ensuring that they were administered according to law. The prevention of crime was considered as important as its punishment, and police forces worked to maintain visible presences in areas where criminal activity was likely to occur. Regular patrols, checkpoint operations, and community policing efforts were all used to deter criminal activity and to reassure law-abiding citizens that they were protected from harm. The border security forces that protected Egypt's frontiers were specialized units that combined military and police functions. They were responsible for controlling the movement of people and goods across Egypt's borders, preventing smuggling and illegal immigration, and gathering intelligence about potential threats from neighboring kingdoms. The work was often lonely and dangerous, as border guards were stationed in remote areas where they had to be self-reliant and resourceful. The intelligence services that gathered information about potential threats to Egyptian security were sophisticated organizations that used a variety of methods to collect and analyze information. Spies and informants provided information about the activities of foreign governments and domestic dissidents. The intelligence gathered by these services was used to plan military operations and to prevent threats to Egyptian security before they could develop into serious problems. The veteran soldiers who had completed their military service often continued to serve Egyptian society in civilian capacities, using the skills and experience they had gained in the military to contribute to the kingdom's prosperity and security. Many became police officers, government administrators, or private security guards. Their military experience made them valuable employees who could be trusted with important responsibilities. The military traditions and values that were instilled in Egyptian soldiers had lasting effects on their character and behavior throughout their lives. The discipline, loyalty, and courage that were essential for military service became part of their personal identity and influenced their approach to all aspects of life. These values were passed on to their children and helped to maintain the social stability that was essential for Egyptian civilization. The honor and respect accorded to military and police service reflected the Egyptian understanding that security and order were essential foundations for all other aspects of civilization. Without the protection provided by these forces, the farmers could not work their fields, the craftsmen could not practice their trades, and the priests could not perform their rituals. The soldiers and police who provided this protection were therefore honored as essential contributors to the welfare of Egyptian society. The practice of medicine in ancient Egypt was a sophisticated blend of empirical observation, religious belief, and practical experience that produced a healthcare system that was remarkably advanced for its time. The physicians, surgeons, and healers who provided medical care to the Egyptian people possessed knowledge and skills that were respected throughout the ancient world, and that laid the foundation for many modern medical practices. The training of physicians in ancient Egypt was a lengthy and comprehensive process that combined theoretical study with practical experience under the guidance of experienced practitioners. Medical students would begin their education by learning to read and write the hieroglyphic texts that contained medical knowledge, then progress to studying anatomy, physiology, and the properties of medicinal plants and other therapeutic substances. The medical schools that trained Egyptian physicians were typically associated with temples, where the healing arts were considered sacred activities that required divine blessing and guidance. The students would study the medical papyri that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations of physicians, memorizing diagnostic procedures, treatment protocols, and surgical techniques that had been proven effective through centuries of practice. The daily routine of a practicing physician involved seeing patients, diagnosing their conditions, and prescribing treatments that might include medications, surgical procedures, or lifestyle changes. Egyptian physicians were skilled in taking medical histories, conducting physical examinations, and interpreting symptoms to arrive at accurate diagnoses. They understood the importance of careful observation and systematic approach to medical problems. The diagnostic techniques used by Egyptian physicians were sophisticated and comprehensive, involving careful examination of the patient's appearance, behavior, and bodily functions. Physicians would check the pulse, examine the eyes and tongue, palpate the abdomen, and observe the patient's breathing and movement patterns. They understood that different diseases produced characteristic signs and symptoms that could be used to identify the underlying condition. The treatment of disease in ancient Egypt involved a wide range of therapeutic approaches that reflected the Egyptian understanding of the complex relationship between physical, mental, and spiritual health. Medications made from plants, minerals, and animal products were used to treat specific symptoms and conditions. Surgical procedures were performed when necessary to remove tumors, set broken bones, or treat injuries. The pharmacological knowledge of Egyptian physicians was extensive and sophisticated, based on centuries of experimentation and observation. They understood the therapeutic properties of hundreds of different substances and knew how to prepare them in forms that would be most effective for treating specific conditions. The preparation of medications required specialized knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology that was among the most advanced in the ancient world. The surgical skills of Egyptian physicians were remarkable for their time, involving complex procedures that required precise knowledge of anatomy and sophisticated surgical techniques. Egyptian surgeons could perform cataract surgery, set complex bone fractures, and remove tumors and other growths. They understood the importance of cleanliness and sterile technique in preventing infection and promoting healing. The medical instruments used by Egyptian physicians were carefully designed and crafted to perform specific functions effectively and safely. Surgical knives, forceps, probes, and other instruments were made from bronze and other metals that could be sharpened to fine edges and sterilized to prevent infection. The design of these instruments reflected a deep understanding of human anatomy and surgical requirements. The treatment of mental and emotional disorders was an important aspect of Egyptian medicine that reflected the understanding that psychological health was as important as physical health. Egyptian physicians recognized that emotional stress, grief, and other psychological factors could cause physical symptoms, and that effective treatment required attention to both mental and physical aspects of illness. The role of women in Egyptian medicine was significant and respected, with female physicians and healers providing care that was particularly valued for certain types of conditions. Women were especially skilled in obstetrics and gynecology, areas where their understanding of female physiology and their ability to provide emotional support were particularly valuable. Female healers also specialized in the treatment of children and in the preparation of medications and therapeutic substances. The public health measures implemented by Egyptian authorities reflected an understanding of the preventing disease as well as treating it. Sanitation systems, water quality controls, and food safety regulations were all designed to prevent the spread of disease and to maintain the health of the population. The Egyptians understood that clean water, proper waste disposal, and good nutrition were essential for maintaining public health. The medical care provided to different social classes varied considerably, with the wealthy having access to the most skilled physicians and the most expensive treatments, while the poor relied on folk healers and traditional remedies. However, even the basic medical care available to ordinary Egyptians was remarkably sophisticated and effective, reflecting the high overall level of medical knowledge in Egyptian society. The documentation of medical knowledge in written form was a crucial aspect of Egyptian medicine that allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. The medical papyri that have survived from ancient Egypt contain detailed descriptions of diseases, treatments, and surgical procedures that provide invaluable insights into the sophistication of Egyptian medical practice. The integration of religious and magical elements into medical practice reflected the Egyptian understanding that healing involved spiritual as well as physical dimensions. Prayers, incantations, and ritual procedures were often combined with practical medical treatments to provide comprehensive care that addressed all aspects of the patient's condition. This holistic approach to medicine was often more effective than purely physical treatments. The specialization within Egyptian medicine allowed physicians to develop expertise in particular areas of practice, leading to more effective treatment. For specific types of conditions, specialists in surgery, internal medicine, obstetrics, and other fields could focus their study and practice on particular areas of knowledge, developing skills and expertise that would not have been possible with a more generalized approach. The international reputation of Egyptian medicine led to Egyptian physicians being sought after by rulers and wealthy individuals throughout the ancient world. Egyptian medical knowledge was exported to other civilizations, influencing the development of medicine in Greece, Rome, and other cultures. The respect accorded to Egyptian medicine reflected the high quality of care that Egyptian physicians were able to provide. The ethical standards that governed Egyptian medical practice were sophisticated and comprehensive, reflecting the understanding that physicians held positions of great trust and responsibility. Medical ethics required physicians to put the welfare of their patients above their own interests, to maintain confidentiality, and to continue learning and improving their skills. Throughout their careers, the legacy of Egyptian medicine extends far beyond the ancient world to influence modern medical practice in many ways. The emphasis on careful observation, systematic diagnosis, and comprehensive treatment that characterized Egyptian medicine remains fundamental to good medical practice today. The holistic approach that considered physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of health continues to influence modern understanding of the healing process. Beyond the specialized occupations that defined Egyptian society lay the fundamental rhythms of family and community life that provided the foundation for all other activities. The daily routines of ordinary Egyptian families, with their cycles of work, rest, celebration, and worship, created the social fabric that held Egyptian civilization together and gave meaning to individual lives within the larger context of one of history's greatest cultures. The structure of Egyptian families was both stable and flexible, providing security and support for individuals, while adapting to the changing needs and circumstances of different life stages. Most Egyptian families were nuclear units consisting of parents and their children, but extended family relationships were also important and provided additional sources of support and assistance when needed. The daily routine of family life began before dawn, when the mother of the household would rise to prepare the morning meal and organize the day's activities. The preparation of food was a central activity that required careful planning and considerable skill, as meals had to be nutritious, flavorful, and appropriate for the family's social status and economic circumstances. The father of the family would typically leave early for his work, whether in the fields, workshops, or other places of employment. His role as provider and protector was central to the family's welfare, and his success or failure in his occupation would directly affect the family's standard of living and social status. The relationship between husband and wife was generally characterized by mutual respect and shared responsibility for the family's welfare. The children in Egyptian families were valued and cherished, but they were also expected to contribute to the family's welfare according to their age and abilities. Young children would help with simple household tasks and would begin learning the skills they would need as adults. Older children would take on more substantial responsibilities and would often work alongside their parents to learn the family trade or occupation. The education of children was primarily the responsibility of the family, with parents teaching their children the practical skills, moral values, and cultural knowledge they would need to function effectively in Egyptian society. Formal education was available only to a small elite, so most children learned what they needed to know through observation, imitation, and gradual participation in adult activities. The role of women in Egyptian families was complex and varied, depending on social class and individual circumstances. Women were generally responsible for managing the household, raising children, and often contributing to the family's income through their own work or business activities. Egyptian women enjoyed more legal rights and social freedom than women in many other ancient civilizations. The daily work of managing a household was demanding and required a wide range of skills and knowledge. Women had to be skilled in food preparation, textile production, childcare, and household management. They often supervised servants and managed complex household economies that included multiple sources of income and expenditure. The social life of Egyptian families was rich and varied, involving participation in community festivals, religious ceremonies, and social gatherings that strengthened bonds between families and maintained the cultural traditions that defined Egyptian identity. These social activities provided opportunities for entertainment, education, and the reinforcement of social values and relationships. The religious life of families was centered around household shrines and daily rituals that connected family members to the gods and to the larger cosmic order that governed Egyptian life. Family religious practices included daily offerings, prayers, and ceremonies that marked important life events such as births, marriages, and deaths. The economic life of families was based on a combination of subsistence, production, and market exchange that allowed families to meet their basic needs while also participating in the larger economy. Most families produced some of their own food, clothing, and other necessities while also earning income through specialized work or trade activities. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural life also affected family routines and activities. During the flood season, when agricultural work was impossible, families would focus on craft production, home maintenance, and social activities. The growing season required intensive work in the fields, while the harvest season was a time of intense activity and celebration. The housing of Egyptian families varied considerably depending on their economic status and location. Wealthy families lived in large, comfortable houses with multiple rooms, courtyards, and gardens. Poor families lived in small, simple structures that provided basic shelter but few amenities. Most families lived in modest homes that were functional and comfortable without being luxurious. The furnishing and decoration of homes reflected both practical needs and aesthetic preferences that varied according to family wealth and social status. Furniture was generally simple and functional, made from local materials such as wood, red, and leather. Decorative objects and artwork were used to beautify homes and to display the family's cultural sophistication and religious devotion. The health and medical care of family members was primarily the responsibility of the family, with mothers typically serving as the primary caregivers for sick or injured family members. Families would use traditional remedies and folk medicine for minor ailments while seeking professional medical care for serious conditions. The knowledge of medicinal plants and healing techniques was often passed down through generations of women. The care of elderly family members was considered a sacred duty that reflected the Egyptian values of respect for age and wisdom. Elderly parents and grandparents were typically cared for by their adult children and were valued for their experience and knowledge. The elderly played important roles in family decision-making and in the transmission of cultural traditions to younger generations. The celebration of life events, such as births, marriages, and deaths, was an important aspect of family and community. Life that reinforced social bonds and cultural values. These celebrations involved elaborate rituals feasts, and ceremonies that brought together extended families and community members in shared experiences of joy or mourning. The resolution of conflicts and disputes within families and communities was handled through traditional mechanisms that emphasized reconciliation and the restoration of harmony rather than punishment. Elders and respected community members would mediate disputes and help conflicting parties find mutually acceptable solutions to their problems. The transmission of cultural knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next was a crucial function of family life that ensured the continuity of Egyptian civilization. Parents and grandparents would tell stories, teach songs, and demonstrate traditional skills and practices that preserved the cultural heritage of the community. The adaptation of families to changing circumstances and challenges was a constant process that required flexibility, creativity, and mutual support. Families had to cope with economic hardships, natural disasters, political upheavals, and other challenges that threatened their welfare and stability. The strength of family bonds and community support systems often determined how successfully families could adapt to these challenges. The legacy of Egyptian family life continues to influence modern understanding of the importance of family relationships and community support in creating stable and prosperous societies. The values of mutual respect, shared responsibility, and intergenerational support that characterized Egyptian families remain relevant and important in contemporary life. After exploring Egyptian daily life, we arrive at the profound question: how did this civilization endure for over 3 millennia? The secret was not just truth and justice, but a complete system addressing every human need, from physical to spiritual. Matt recognized humans need purpose beyond survival. The Egyptians made work sacred. Every job, from pharaoh to farmer, maintained cosmic order. The farmer participated in eternal cycles. The craftsmen created homes for gods. Even gold miners provided divine flesh. This transformed labor into worship, giving everyone cosmic purpose. First secret: make every person's work matter. Second, understanding time as cyclical. Sun died nightly, reborn daily. Nile flooded eternally. Disasters were temporary disruptions in eternal order. This gave extraordinary resilience. Egyptians rebuilt confidently, knowing they participated in eternal cycles. Third, social organization, hierarchical but mobile. Farmers' sons became scribes, balanced by tradition and gradual change. Fourth, balancing individual and community. Achievement was celebrated within service to gods and community, preventing destructive individualism while encouraging innovation. Fifth, democratized immortality. Eternal life was promised to all following Matt. Everyone had stake in civilization's continuation because they're eternal. Welfare depended on it. This created incentive to preserve culture. Parents taught children beliefs and traditions, ensuring continuation. The result: remarkably stable civilization, balancing change and continuity, individual achievement and community service, practical needs and spiritual aspirations. This secret worked for 3,000 years, even when conquered, when religion changed, when language was forgotten. Egyptian insights continued influencing human culture. As you drift toward sleep, consider this wisdom. You can participate in something eternal, connecting to the great chain of human experience. Every moment is opportunity to contribute to creation's eternal order, transforming existence into worship. As our journey through the working world of ancient Egypt draws to a close, we find ourselves contemplating the deeper meanings and enduring significance of work and daily life in this remarkable civilization. For the Egyptians, work was never merely about earning a living or completing tasks. It was about participating in the eternal cycles of creation and renewal that governed all existence, and finding one's place in the cosmic order that connected all living things. The Egyptian understanding of work was deeply rooted in their observation of the natural world around them. They saw how the annual flooding of the Nile brought new life to the land, how the daily rising and setting of the sun marked the rhythm of all activity, and how the seasonal cycles of planting, growth, and harvest reflected the eternal patterns of death and rebirth that governed all existence. This cyclical understanding of work and life was reflected in Egyptian religious beliefs and practices. The god Ptah, who was associated with craftsmanship and creation, was believed to have created the world through his work, speaking things into existence through the power of divine labor. The goddess Seshat, who presided over writing and record-keeping, was seen as the divine patron of all who worked with knowledge and information. The daily performance of work was seen as a participation in this divine creative process. When Egyptian farmers planted seeds in the fertile soil, they were participating in the eternal cycle of creation that connected them to the gods and to the cosmic forces that sustained all life. When craftsmen shaped raw materials into useful and beautiful objects, they were continuing the work of creation that had begun with the formation of the world itself. The sharing of work within families and communities was understood to create bonds not only between individuals, but also between the human and divine realms. When families worked together to harvest their crops or to build their homes, they were participating in a sacred act that reinforced their connections to each other and to the gods who provided their sustenance and protection. The elaborate festivals and celebrations that marked important points in the working year were expressions of gratitude for the opportunity to participate in meaningful work and for the abundance that such work could produce. These celebrations were not just displays of prosperity, but were acknowledgments of the divine generosity that made productive work possible. The teaching of work skills from one generation to the next was seen as a way of maintaining the cosmic balance that ensured the continued prosperity and stability of Egyptian civilization. By passing on their knowledge and skills to their children, Egyptian workers were ensuring the continuation of the divine order that had sustained their society for thousands of years. The specialization of work that characterized Egyptian society was understood to reflect the divine plan that had assigned different roles and responsibilities to different people according to their abilities and circumstances. Each type of work, from the humblest agricultural labor to the most sophisticated craftsmanship, was seen as essential to the functioning of the whole and as worthy of respect and honor. The seasonal rhythms that governed much of Egyptian work were seen as reflections of the eternal cycles that governed all existence. The flood season represented death and renewal. The growing season represented life and growth. and the harvest season represented fulfillment and abundance. These cycles were understood to be manifestations of divine will and cosmic order. The tools and techniques that Egyptian workers developed to perform their tasks more effectively were seen as gifts from the gods and as evidence of divine favor. The invention of new tools or the improvement of existing techniques was understood to be a form of divine inspiration that benefited not only the individual worker but the entire community. The pride that Egyptian workers took in their craftsmanship and the quality of their work was understood to be a form of worship that honored the gods and contributed to the beauty and order of the world. The creation of beautiful and useful objects was seen as a way of participating in the divine creative process and of making the world more perfect and harmonious. The cooperation between different types of workers that was necessary for major projects was understood to reflect the divine harmony that governed the cosmos. When farmers, craftsmen, scribes, and laborers worked together to build a temple or a pyramid, they were creating a microcosm of the divine order that ruled the universe. The economic systems that supported Egyptian work and trade were seen as manifestations of divine justice and cosmic balance. The fair exchange of goods and services, the honest measurement of quantities, and the equitable distribution of resources were all understood to be requirements of divine law that ensured the prosperity and stability of society. The social recognition accorded to different types of work reflected the Egyptian understanding that all honest labor was valuable and worthy of respect. While some types of work were more prestigious than others, all work that contributed to the welfare of society was seen as honorable and important. The legacy of Egyptian work traditions extends far beyond the ancient world to influence modern understanding of the relationship between work and meaning in human life. The Egyptian emphasis on craftsmanship, quality, and pride in work continues to inspire workers and artisans today. The understanding of work as a form of participation in the creative process remains relevant for those who seek meaning and purpose in their daily labor. As we conclude our exploration of work and daily life in ancient Egypt, we can appreciate the profound wisdom and sophistication of this ancient civilization, their understanding of work as something sacred, their appreciation for the skills and knowledge that made productive work possible, and their recognition of the social and spiritual dimensions of labor, all offer valuable insights for our modern world. The gentle lapping of the Nile against its banks, the soft sounds of craftsmen at their work, and the distant calls of farmers in their fields all remind us of the timeless nature of human labor and the eternal human quest for meaningful work. The need for productive activity, the satisfaction of creating something useful and beautiful, and the pride that comes from contributing to the welfare of one's community are experiences that connect us across the millennia to our ancient ancestors. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself working alongside the ancient Egyptians, sharing in their daily labors and their deep understanding of the sacred nature of work. Let the wisdom of this ancient civilization inspire your own approach to work and life, just as their example has inspired countless generations of workers and craftsmen throughout history. The eternal cycle of work and rest, creation and renewal, effort and reward continues, as it has for thousands of years, carrying with it the promise of meaningful labor, the satisfaction of accomplishment, and the deep fulfillment that comes from participating in the great work of civilization that connects all human beings across time and space. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this ancient tradition, this timeless celebration of human creativity and the dignity of honest work.